Good morning to all of you who are signing in from the US. Good afternoon to all of you who are watching us from Europe, and a good evening to those of you in Asia. We have hundreds of participants who are signing in just now from across the world, from Tatarklubben and AVT in Denmark to more than 20 chapters throughout Europe of the American Chamber of Commerce, and also the HBR subscriber base globally. A warm welcome to you all. My name is Klaus Mosbeck. I'm the club chair of Tatarklubben, and I'll be your host today, and we're live from our studios in Copenhagen. HBR's mission is to improve the management practices in a changing world, and well, the world has certainly changed, and our aim with these virtual sessions is to give you the inspiration you need to lead and manage through the pandemic. Before we get started, I just have a few introductory remarks. The session is best viewed on either a laptop or a tablet or a desktop and in a Chrome browser. Alex's presentation will take about 30 minutes, after which we'll take your questions. But do feel free already now to start engaging in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. The session will be recorded and uploaded to our Vimeo channel for you to share afterwards in your network. You're able to buy today's book with a 20% discount as an ebook on Harvard Business Review's website. A link is included in the text just above this screen. And now for today's keynote. Over the past decade, Silicon Valley has codified what a startup should look like and dictated how it should be built and defined what a culture should be. However, the Silicon Valley model doesn't work everywhere and has shown cracks even at home. The world of innovation needs a refresh, and now is the time to do it. In Out-Innovate, how global entrepreneurs from Delhi to Detroit are rewriting the rules of Silicon Valley, Lazarow reveals a revolution that is already underway at the frontier, the outside of the most developed startup ecosystems, where entrepreneurs are out-innovating their Silicon Valley rivals. Alex himself is a venture capitalist with Cathay Innovation and an adjunct professor specializing in social impact investment and entrepreneurship at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. All the way from sunny California. Thank you for joining us today, Alex.
Thank you, Klaus. And thank you, everyone, for joining me for the discussion of my new book, Out-Innovate, How Global Entrepreneurs from Delhi to Detroit Are Rewriting the Rules of Silicon Valley. First, why am I here and who am I? My name is Alex Lazarow. By day, I'm a venture capitalist. Today, I work for a fund called Cathay Innovation, a Paris-based group with about $500 million fund investing across Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa. Before this, I was with the Omidyar Network, which is the venture fund and family office of Pierre and Pam Omidyar. Pierre's the founder of eBay. And so that's my day job, investing in startups around the world. And then outside of work, I've been teaching entrepreneurship at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies, which is Middlebury College's graduate program in Monterey. And in both of those experiences, I've been getting frustrated. I felt like I was always assigning my students books on innovation best practice, but everything was highly centered in a time and a place, the Silicon Valley context, and for very specific types of asset-light, software-based startups that wanted to grow extraordinarily fast. And so I always felt like I had to contextualize what I was sharing with them with the reality of building startups in different ecosystems, in ecosystems with less capital, with less resources or less trained startup human capital, or that face more macroeconomic challenges. And the same went for the entrepreneurs that I was sharing information with or wanted to give advice to. And I believe that the best entrepreneurs operating in Detroit or Chicago or Amsterdam or Copenhagen or Nairobi or Bangalore have more in common with the best entrepreneurs in Sao Paulo than they do with those in San Francisco. And yet no one is telling their stories. And so I decided I would. And so the culmination of that work is this book, Out-Innovate. I interviewed about 200 entrepreneurs from around the world. About 60 of them are featured in the book. And I think taken together, what Out-Innovate provides is not only simple wisdoms around the world are challenging, but increasingly a new playbook altogether on how to build and succeed at innovation around the world in different ecosystems. So before I tell you what's in the book, what I thought I would do is tell you a little bit about why it's so important, what we're talking about today and in the macroeconomic context. So it's undeniable the impact of innovation in the US and around the world. This is a study by Stanford on the innovation industry in the US, just as a proxy for it. 40% of the US's publicly traded companies were once venture-backed startups. They represent 60% of total market cap, and remarkably, over 80% of total R&D. And some of the names will not be surprising, things like Tesla, et cetera, but some will be, right? Like Whole Foods and Costco and others. And so innovation has been a really big driver, and this is a innovation model innovation, to job creation and the reinvention of our economy. What's happened, though, in the last few years is that innovation has gone global. Today, a startup can be built anywhere. So on the one hand, we now have a range of business infrastructure that makes it much cheaper to build a startup. Things like Amazon Web Services, for instance, allow anyone to rent a supercomputer by the hour instead of having to pay a really expensive server stack in their office. While VC is still highly concentrated in some ecosystems, it's becoming more and more global and plentiful. We're exporting entrepreneurial culture all around the world and this notion of building startups. And in many countries, entrepreneurship has made its way to the top of the foreign and domestic policy agenda as something to be supported. And so around the world, folks are really focused on driving innovation. So what's happened? Well, today, innovation is truly global. There's about 1.3 million startups around the world across 480 startup hubs. And among if you call it companies over $1 billion, 50% of them come from outside Silicon Valley. A big chunk of them obviously are in China, but 10% are coming from emerging markets. And so it's really accelerating in this global way. And so in the book, I really talk about this concept of the frontier. And obviously, a place like Silicon Valley is different than many emerging ecosystems, but obviously the frontier is also heterogeneous. I think there's two important dimensions. One is how developed is the country, and second is how developed is the startup ecosystem. And so you could say, perhaps places like Silicon Valley are both in a developed country and have high ecosystem intensity, have a thriving startup ecosystem. My book brings you as far as Pyongyang and obviously on the other end of the spectrum on both of those, but also places like Bangalore, which are in developing countries but very thriving startup ecosystems, or where I'm from, Winnipeg, which has a developing startup ecosystem, but operating within Canada. And so within that, there's a really broad context. And so in the book and in this talk, I will sometimes stretch us to places with very opposite contexts to really show you the differences. And in other cases, we'll talk about some of the nuances in other locations. But ultimately, I think what I want to leave you with is this notion that Silicon Valley has one context, and that context is miles apart from the rest of the world. And there's this really big gap in what it takes to build businesses. And so I actually want to bridge that gap on how to succeed in those ecosystems. That's the point of the book, is to share some of the best practices of what happens on the other side. Before I tell you how to build startups, I want to talk a little bit about what are the startups that are getting built, because I actually think this is one of the most fundamental and, for me personally, exciting pieces of the story. I think that the best startups around the world are building different types of companies. So in Silicon Valley, we are obsessed with this notion of disruption. The gentleman on the right here is Clayton Christensen, a professor at the Harvard Business School, who coined this term of disruption. He wasn't talking about technology startups. He was talking about steel mills, where there were these big integrated steel mills that were not serving the entirety of the market and started getting disrupted by these nimble players, these mini mills at the bottom end. And over time, the mini mills captured the whole market. It is this emotionally appealing story, a modern day David and Goliath of the small, nimble player, upstart, really finding a market gap that is being ignored and solving it. And that has actually proven to work extraordinarily well in the Valley. And it's not just an approach, it's actually an attitude and a philosophy. But around the world, the best entrepreneurs are taking a different approach. They're creators. They're not disruptors. They're not focused on looking at an existing industry and disrupting it with a new attitude. They're looking to build entire new industries themselves. So what do I mean? It's three things. The first is offering a product or service that solves an unserved acute pain point in the formal economy, or in some cases actually just brings formality to their industry, something that exists in the informal industry. Second is the products that they offer are for the mass market for day one, not just something for the top of the pyramid. And third, they are often the shoulders of giants upon which others build. And this isn't just a semantic difference. It also translates directly in the types of companies that are getting built. So a study by Village Capital looked at the unicorns, term colloquially referenced for startups worth over $1 billion in the US, and less than 20% of them are focused in industries like financial services, healthcare, education, et cetera, really high impact industries. You look at that same data point in many emerging markets, the story is the opposite. In sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, the number is over 60%, really meaningful difference. So focusing on different industries, building different is exciting, is the way that impact is weaved into the business model. I call them multi-mission athletes. So why did I put such a violent photo to talk about something about social impact? So mixed martial arts has very quietly made its way into the elite training for SWAT teams and commandos around the world. And essentially what they do is they're using multiple fighting techniques to get to one objective. And I actually believe the same thing is happening in business, where people are not just thinking about for-profit metrics, they're actually thinking about a different set of metrics as well that all are tied to operational success of the business. So that's what I mean by MMAs. And it's often where the impact of the business is interwoven with the outcomes and the success of the business. And so in some cases, it's actually very easy to do that. In other cases, it's more nuanced. They are a solar home system provider in Africa. There's about 1.2 billion people that don't have access to formal power. To get light, they burn kerosene, literally burn jet fuel. It has a range of negative health outcomes, not the least of which that you might burn your house down, but educational attainment among kids is lower because of lower quality light, et cetera. What Zola does is they provide a home solar system. Imagine a couple solar panels, a battery, some lights, cell phone chargers, a radio, TV. And while the families can't afford the system up front, they can afford the small amount of money they paid every day for kerosene. And so they essentially have matched the cash flows with a pay-as-you-go system enabled by mobile banking. In their case, being an MMA is pretty straightforward, right? They're creating the industry, and every time they sell a product, they're having impact on their customer. And so engagement, repayment, usage, all directly tied to social impact and obviously the operational success of the business. The case of Revigo, on the other hand, I think is really interesting and also shows that you can be a business that is an MMA in almost any industry. Revigo is a logistics business in India. And like in many emerging markets, the Indian logistics market is actually incredibly inefficient. And it's actually a really poor deal for many drivers. So in many cases, a driver will drive from one location all the way to another and then have an empty load coming back. So half the time empty, you'll be away from home the whole time. Revigo's focus and their tagline is making logistics human. And so what does that mean for them? For them, it means how do we actually change the experience for the driver? And so in their case, a driver drives in one direction 24 hours max and does a little bit of a trade-off with another driver who takes it in another direction and trades the load and goes back. And so at any point in time, a driver is supposed to only be gone for 24 hours in any direction and should hopefully have a load in both directions. And so the metrics that Revigo cares a lot about are what's the percentage time their drivers are occupied? How many nights are they staying at home, et cetera? Because by having a focus on the driver, they're actually able to decrease driver churn, increase the efficiency of their business model, et cetera. And so that's what I mean by being an MMA. And the last point that I'll leave you with tied to this is this notion of managing risk. In Silicon Valley, I think one of the taglines is this idea of move fast and break things. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes, and risk is acceptable. And that works in that particular context of software or things that are not essential. But when you are offering something like financial service, healthcare, light to someone's home, you can't actually move fast and break things. You actually have to think about managing risk. This is a photo of a vertical farm. I interviewed David Rosenberg, who's a CEO, one of the leaders in the space, a company called Aero Farms in New Jersey. And when I asked him about risk, he told me, looked at me squarely in the eyes and said, rule number one is don't kill your customer. And the reality is for a business like Aero Farms, just like for Zola and others, it is critical to think about the risk in your business. Obviously, you have to take some risk. We have to think about the ones that are acceptable to take and not acceptable. And the ones that are not acceptable, you mitigate them rigorously. And so for what Aero Farms, for their business, they do three things. One is a lot of the metrics that are really key here are reported directly to the board and are the KPIs throughout the organization. Two is it's actually ingrained into the organizational structure. So for instance, there is someone in charge of health and safety in every vertical farm. That person reports outside the org structure and directly to headquarters rather than to the head of the farm, just to make sure the incentives are correct. And third, he's created a really bottoms up culture, right? They're creating a new industry. There are no standards. And they're in many ways figuring out what the standards are on how to do vertical farming really well. And so he actually wants everyone to have a voice in setting it. And so some of their most rigorous policies have been actually suggested by the folks that are on the front lines and know the most of it. Why is this important? When I ask my students, what are some of the entrepreneurs they admire the most and they think are really changing the world? Invariably, they'll talk about someone like Elon Musk. And then I'll ask them, well, name me two or three other people in the valley or in that mold. And often they'll struggle. And I can point you to dozens of Elons around the world. And I actually think we have an opportunity to learn from their lessons. Coming out of this crisis, we have laid bare some of the challenges. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And I actually think it's now a time for us to learn from the best entrepreneurs that are solving challenges through this business model and technological innovation. So we talked a little bit about what entrepreneurs build. I also want to talk a little bit about how they build it, because I think that is fundamentally different as well. And I'll start with one concept, which is this notion of balanced growth. In the Valley, there's this chase for I alluded to it earlier. The unicorn is both a numerical value, startup, a lot of build startups. And if the philosophy is to chase unicorns, the method is growth. It's growth at all costs. It's okay to subsidize user acquisition or give your product away for free in service of growth. It's okay to burn a lot of capital and hire ahead of growth just in service of accelerating it down the line. And timelines are really short because you really need to get there as quickly as possible. For every startup, there's a valley of death, which is this is the cumulative cash curve of a startup. So when a startup starts, obviously they're losing money, investing in some revenue, and then hopefully over time, the cash curve comes to the other side. What happens in the valley is in service of growth, the cash curve at the bottom is jacked down. So more burn, giving away things for free, et cetera, in service of accelerating the revenue line at the top. And that can work well for churches I don't everywhere, and is much higher risk. And so around the world, what do I believe the answer is? I talk about the camel as another animal. So why did I choose the camel? The camel, when there's opportunity, when there's water, can drink faster than almost any other animal, can sprint across the desert, but can also survive and be resilient in the world's harshest environments. And that's the context in many emerging startup ecosystems. And I actually believe should actually be the motto that we look for going forward. So what does the camel's value of death look like? It's based on three principles. One is charge for the value you create. So don't give away things for free, charge for that value. One example I like a lot is I interviewed this entrepreneur in Zambia, and their tagline was easy, quick, safe. I asked them about pricing. They said, look, we're neither free nor cheap. We actually are a premium service, but we charge for the value we create. And I think that's really cool. Or the second is managing costs. Thinking about burn, but thinking, it's normal for a startup to burn in service of growth. And the objective of Camels is also to build very large, successful, enduring businesses, but doing it from a position of managing burn. And third is raising capital for a specific purpose. I'll tell you one story, which I think really resonates for me. It's the case of Grubhub, which is an on-demand delivery startup based in Chicago. I often think of on-demand delivery, and I think of the venture subsidized model. Think of DoorDash. It's raised $1.5 billion. By Silicon Valley standards, Grubhub raised a paltry amount, less than $100 million, about $80 million in venture before their IPO. They're a multi-billion-dollar business today. And when I asked Mike Evans, who was the CEO and one of the co-founders, he talked about how he was sustainable and profitable at every fundraise. And every fundraise was for a very specific purpose. Their curve looked more like this, ditches of death in their case, where they made modulating investments in service of growth to scale up. I asked him, look, could you have done this faster? How did you think about that trade-off? It took him about 8 years to IPO. And he said, look, we could have done it two years faster, but we would have done it at meaningfully more risk. And that's really what I'm talking about here. When we look at some of the most successful startups in Silicon Valley, we are seeing one version of that story, where that company happened to be successful. But if you play that story back the other 9 of the 10 times, we don't know what would have happened. In this Camel approach, I believe that we will get the one story, but I think more often and more repeatably, we will get the outcomes that we're all looking for, which is building sustainable, scaled, successful businesses. And so with that, maybe I'll tell you one last story, which is the story of Qualtrics, which is based in Salt Lake City. When I interviewed Ryan, the CEO, and essentially what they offer is survey software. They started in the university space. And Ryan told me, look, we didn't take any venture capital, and their big breakthrough actually didn't happen in any normal startup venture timeline. It actually happened 10 years in, after 10 years, at year 12 and 13, when they switched the enterprise model. And having time in this long-term approach really gave them the flexibility to iterate and get to a model that worked. And so that's really what I'm talking about, is taking this long-term view. They eventually did raise venture capital. They recently sold to SAP for $8 billion. So they're an incredibly successful startup, but they embodied this Camel-like approach. Tied to this idea, if you think of the Camel, in many ways, it's a notion of taking a constraint, having less capital and a tougher ecosystem, and turning it into an advantage of being more resilient. In many ways, the same thing is true across a myriad dimensions at the frontier. And I'll tell you about a couple others that I think are meaningful. The first is thinking about being born global. So in many startup ecosystems outside the US, entrepreneurs are operating in markets, in local markets that are smaller, that have less, what we might call a TAM, total addressable market. And as a result, entrepreneurs are actually building their organization, their culture, their product to be born global. They're turning that constraint again into an advantage. One, I think, of the marquee cases here globally is the case of UiPath. This is Daniel Dines, the CEO. UiPath is a business that does robotic process automation. Imagine having repeated tasks in white-collar work of taking something in one spreadsheet, putting in another database, or what have you. They can essentially create automated programs, bots that can do some of these tasks. UiPath started in Romania. And when I asked Daniel about how he thought about that and whether or not that was an advantage or not, he said, unequivocally for him, it was. Because from the get-go, they had to adapt their product to different cultures, different style of organizations, different languages, et cetera, because the Romanian market just wasn't going to be big enough for the product of the business. And today, UiPath is arguably the fastest growing enterprise business in the Western world of all times, and has out-innovated its competitors all around the world, including those in Silicon Valley. And I actually think this is a really good example of turning one of these constraints into advantages. Another one is this notion of building the full stack. In many startup ecosystems, there isn't the same business infrastructure that there is in the Valley to build your startup. I'll tell you the case of Guia Bolso in Brazil, which is offering a personal finance manager. Imagine a little app where you see all your accounts, you get personalized offers on better credit cards or what have you. There's been some really successful businesses been built in this category in the US, for instance, companies like Mint.com. What Mint had to do is they built the app and they could plug in automatically to piping to connect to all the bank accounts, the structure that's called FICO, as well as a pretty ready network of people that are willing to bid on customers. In Brazil, Guia Bolso had to do something radically different. So they built the app, but there were no bank interconnection layers. They had to build each of those individually. They built a second business. And then when they wanted to offer consumers options and have insights on their credit scores, there isn't a credit. At the time, there wasn't a credit scoring infrastructure. You were either in the blacklist in default or you weren't. And so they had to build their own platform to do that too. And then eventually when they wanted to get people to lend on the platform, they also had to build that as well. And so to build their ultimate business, they built 4 things just to build the one. And this is a really good example of having to do a lot more with a lot less. And yet, one of the things that's really powerful about this story is that now they actually have this really powerful moat that's harder for others to come in as a result. And so this is another example of, look, there is a silver lining and competitive advantage that comes out of being a creator, building these full stack style solutions. A discussion around innovation is always incomplete without talking about the team. I think that there are 3 key inputs to a startup, and one is the idea, often second is capital, and third, and often the most important, is the team. And in many startup ecosystems, entrepreneurs are operating ecosystems with less depth of trained startup human capital, folks that have been there, done that. And in the book, I talk about, and we can talk more about this in the questions, different strategies that entrepreneurs have around finding talent, expanding the pipeline beyond the traditional resume assessment process. Two is changing the attitude away from just hiring A players and it's okay for churn to happen and for employee churn to be built into the business model because there's a lot of depth of talent locally, to instead taking a mentality of retention and growing the team into A teams. And the third is with this situation of being in an ecosystem of constraints where there might not be the same depth of local startup human capital, thinking a little bit expansively and also tapping the world for talent. And so I'll double click on this one, which is this notion of distributed teams. We're all in the midst of thinking about how to manage Corona and working from home. But best practice on this has been lying and been built among the best entrepreneurs around the world for years. Startups outside Silicon Valley have been experimenting with distributed teams, and they've been doing it strategically. One of the reasons is to tap the world for the best talent. I come from Winnipeg, for instance, and if I was building a startup and looking to hire a CMO that has already built successfully and scaled a startup, there aren't 500 like there are in the Valley. There aren't 50. There might be 5 or 6, and they are probably occupied with another startup. And so as a consequence, I'd probably look around and build a team wherever I found a person that I was really excited about. And so you could tap talent from wherever it occurs. And by the way, among companies that are distributed, diversity increases because I believe people's work is judged by the output that they provide rather than our preconceptions about who they are and et cetera. And so that's actually been one of the big advantages and things that excites me about this movement. Second, we talked about Born Global. Building a distributed team forces you as an organization to develop the muscles of building a team that can work across borders, that can communicate virtually. And so that actually trains you. And third is this notion of managing labor costs. This is becoming particularly in vogue in the Valley, where engineering costs are really expensive and where entrepreneurs are figuring out ways to tap lower cost ecosystems as well. And I think this will become increasingly important. Ultimately, I think this is this notion of these constraints breed resiliency. If you are building the full stack or having to do a number of products or having a wider geography of startups, locations where you're offering your products, if you're born global, or if you have a distributed teams, those constraints in a situation like the one we have today actually breed resilience as well. And I think that's one of the things that's really powerful and ties back to the Camel point that I was talking about before. So we've talked a lot about the startup ecosystem. I wanted to switch gears and talk a little bit about the venture capital model because VCs, in many ways, are the servants of entrepreneurs. We're in charge of helping entrepreneurs scale. Josh Lerner described the purpose of venture capital in a way that I liked. He talked about an important problem in a market economy occurs when an entrepreneur has a good idea but no money, while investors have money but no good ideas. And so that's what VCs are supposed to bridge. I often ask my students, where do they think the VC model comes from? And they'll often talk about Silicon Valley and questions like something like that. In fact, the roots of venture are much older. This is a log of a whaling ship investor in New Bedford. So in the whaling industry, 70% of the whaling industry was roughly in the US, and 70% of that was in one town, New Bedford. And in many ways, it was because of a financial innovation that they had, which is the way they financed whaling ships. Merchants, our modern day VCs, would invest in boats and captains. Captains would actually rig the boat, get it all set up. They're our modern day entrepreneurs, and they would hire the crew. The crew would not get paid on anything until they came back and they would get their share of the profits. And we talk about carried interest as the method that startup VCs, venture capitalists get paid. That used to literally be what you could carry off the boat. And so that model has been adapted to the Silicon Valley context and has worked extraordinarily well in that context. But as we talked about, that context is different around the world, right? One is less many startup ecosystems, and the startups might look like camels. Two is timelines are longer. There are less natural acquirers. And third is in many markets, entrepreneurs face bigger macroeconomic shocks. And as the startup movement gets proliferated around the world, in the 480 startup hubs, what we're actually going to see, I believe, is some adaptation of that model as well. And so 3 dimensions that I'm excited about are: one, new investment structures. So we took the VC model out of the whaling industry. Another industry that's done really well, for instance, is the mining industry at managing risk in a high risk venture. And we can adapt the royalty model to this idea of revenue shares for different style of businesses. And that's pretty nascent, but I believe will continue to catch on. Evergreens, kind of these longer term funds, are pretty interesting as well. Second, new approaches. The group that I work at, for instance, is Born Global. We have offices around the world. People are thinking about computerized decision making, incorporating some of that to be able to evaluate startups wherever they're from. And then third, new players. I think we're seeing new types of investors coming in. The rise of corporate investors has been well talked about, the rise of impact investors as well. Ultimately, I think it's important, and Eric Hersman, who I had interviewed, who's a leading entrepreneur in the Nairobi ecosystem, said it best. He said, you got to make sure the tail doesn't wag the dog. Today, in many ecosystems, the best startup entrepreneurs are shaping their story, and in some cases, their strategy, to the VC model. In many ways, I think that what should actually happen is the VC model should adapt to serve the needs of the best entrepreneurs wherever they might be. And given the increasing variety of startups there are around the world, that model also needs to be adapted as well. So why did I write this book now? I think this book and the question of how to innovate around the world is more important than ever. We're really at this point where we have, the story has been well told. More and more people have access to electronic communication. We have new technologies that decrease the cost of doing almost anything, including solar home systems in frontier markets. And we have an opportunity to create a tremendous amount of jobs. And so it matters more than ever today to solve some of the challenges that we are facing and to use innovation. But to do those, the singular playbook that we have from the Valley just doesn't translate and won't work. And we need to understand what it takes to build startups around the world from those that have succeeded and done it. And by the way, the Silicon Valley model itself has been starting to show cracks at home. Think of the spate of failed IPOs and the questions around ethical dilemmas and the poverty in Silicon Valley. I think that Silicon Valley as well is looking for a new model. And of course, we are in a current time right now. Sequoia Capital, a leading venture capital firm, talked about the coronavirus as the black swan event, and startups in Silicon Valley, but around the world, really needed to buckle down and focus on resilience, etc. The challenge is that model for how to do that. There aren't that many successful ones in Silicon Valley. And to be able to figure out how to shift to a distributed world, how to shift to being sustainable and resilient, the best entrepreneurs at doing that have already been facing some of these big macroeconomic shocks around the world. And those models are coming from elsewhere. And so we have a real opportunity to figure out what the best practice is. And lastly, obviously, I believe that this is critical for the best entrepreneurs around the world to learn from each other. But I think it is particularly critical as well for Silicon Valley to learn as well, or else it might have its Detroit moment. So 100 years ago, Detroit was Silicon Valley. The technology of the day wasn't software, it was automobiles. And any single entrepreneur that wanted to build a business would move to Detroit. The top 3 startups at the time, or car companies at the time, were all based in Detroit. But then something happened. Innovation went global. Today, the top 3 car companies are not in Detroit. They're not in the US. They're all around the world. And arguably the best place for reliable cars is in Japan. The best place for raw engineering is in Germany. The sexiest sports cars are in Italy. And the best electric cars are in Silicon Valley or in Shenzhen. And that same thing might very well happen in Silicon Valley, where innovation may go global. And for Silicon Valley to keep its place, it needs to learn from, adapt, and evolve to continue to succeed. And so with that, I'll pause for questions, and Klaus, over to you, but happy to double click on any of these topics in more detail. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex, for an inspiring presentation. Now it's the time to engage with our audience through the Q&A, and I see that we already have quite a few questions lined up. So the first one is about borders going up. How do you see that companies can be born global when, for example, we have Ernest who's asking, distributed teams is a great concept, but how about dealing with them in a time of crisis when protectionism, was a tough one, can grow high again?
Yeah. It's an excellent question. And in the Born Global theme, there's a couple of different ideas. One is around the markets you tackle. Two is where your teams are built. And a third idea that I tackle in the book that we didn't talk about as much here is this notion of cross-pollination, where ideas germinate from as well. And if anything, I actually think this theme of being born global is more important today than ever before. If you look at the solutions that are being attempted and tried to solve the coronavirus, it is the result of a number of cross-border collaborations. And so one is, I believe that it is critical and will continue. If we look at many of the stories in the book of around how innovation is working, the best innovations might start somewhere, but they get evolved and improve over time. I'll give you one example, and then we can talk about distributed teams specifically. But ride hailing, that model might have started in Silicon Valley, Uber and Lyft. It got evolved around the world today. The biggest ride hailing business in the world is in China. It's Didi. It got adapted to Southeast Asia. A company called Grab and Gojek built it. Gojek in Southeast Asia, the CEO took a different view. He said, look, I want to build an ecosystem around the drivers. In the morning, I'll drive people to work. At lunch, I'll deliver food. In the evening, I'll drive them home. And after that, I'll deliver food. And throughout the day, I'll offer a range of services. That model of an ecosystem approach has now influenced us everywhere else again. And no surprise that Uber now has Uber Eats and an Uber credit card. And that's one of the reasons that I think some of this cross-border innovation is important. Around Born Global and Distributed, specifically, I think we're at a moment right now. We're in the eye of the storm, and it's hard to predict the future when you're at this very critical moment. But I do think that the trends are going to continue and are only accelerating. On the distributed teams point specifically, we are actually seeing this massive global experiment around how do you build teams, how do you build culture, how do you build a functioning organization in a context where people are not all presently together. And there's obviously a whole range of ways that could manifest itself as distributed to fully remote. But I think that shift in culture is going to accelerate and will get fixed. And it's going to be the best ways to tap talent affordably, to drive diversity, to decrease costs, and to really test your organization's muscle and to build it out.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Thomas from Sweden. He states that Alibaba was built on the back end of SARS in China in 2003 when commerce moved online. Do you believe that something similar will happen in the rest of the world? Now it's a pandemic, forcing out traditional companies who maybe aren't born digital.
Yeah. The CEO of Microsoft last week said that 2 years worth of digital adoption happened in the last 2 months. And I really believe that's true, right? The last 2 months have provided an acceleration of a range of behavior changes towards digital. The other thing that has happened over the last 2 months is that we have laid bare what are some of the massive gaps in our society where there are really big unmet problems, unmet solutions, unmet needs, and where there's an opportunity for entrepreneurs to be creators, to solve them, and solve them with both a combination of technological innovation, largely driven by digital, and business model innovation. And so I actually think that one of the reasons people talk about how unbelievable businesses get built in some of the toughest times is also because you have this combination of creativity that comes with that time of understanding problems more acutely, and two, behavior change that lets you accelerate some of these things. And so I think that, a lot of the challenges that exist today are not new, right? Like in the US, where I live, the fact that we have really big levels of financial exclusion, people don't have, are not financially included, or lack of healthcare or whatever, those problems are not new. I think that they're just better understood and accentuated and laid bare at this moment that we're going to see as a result some really powerful solutions come out of it. And so that's my optimism to what will come out of the situation.
All right. Do you also expect to see more VCs backing camels over unicorns now that we're in a drought?
Yeah, I wrote the book for a different context. I wrote the book, started 2 years ago, a little bit as a reaction to what I was seeing in Silicon Valley and this notion of growth at all costs. And I was observing that the best entrepreneurs around the world were building Camels. They were building sustainability and resilience in their business model from day one because they didn't have the luxury of being in an ecosystem of abundance. They didn't have a luxury of believing there was capital across the stack at any point in their growth story. And so as a result, they built these different types of businesses. We are now all in that ecosystem. We are now all in an ecosystem of lack of abundance. And so as a result, I think that every entrepreneur should be thinking about how do you build sustainability and resilience in your business model from day one. And that will also include venture capitalists who will, I believe, come to value not just this growth spurt, but also take a long-term view on building a successful business and getting an outcome in a risk-adjusted way. That is what both the entrepreneur and the VCs are looking for. And so I'm definitely seeing it play out in the Valley, and it's already been in motion for a long time around the world.
You did a great interview on the HBR Ideacast a few weeks back where you actually mentioned another animal that might be even more appropriate for this during this time of pandemic, namely the cockroach. Can you elaborate?
There is a true menagerie of animals around the world that people have talked about. There's the cockroach, there's the zebra, there's the rhino, and a lot of people are using these metaphors to really communicate different aspects of how to build a startup. I actually like the cockroach analogy. An animal that can survive a nuclear blast and will still survive. And in many ways, this is the eye of the storm right now, and I believe it will pass. And I think there's a question what happens after. But in the short term, we all need to figure out ways. And candidly, my heart goes out to entrepreneurs and small business owners around the world that are facing this unprecedented storm and figuring out how to do it. And so yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I emotionally animal too.
All right, thanks. And so the book is hot off the Harvard Business Review press, and there's a great podcast interview in the HBR Ideacast. You can buy the book online as an ebook with a 20% discount on the HBR website. The discount code is on the top of your screen. And you're also releasing it as an audiobook. Is that coming out soon?
Yeah, all three: audiobook, ebook, and obviously. So it should be available anywhere where books are sold as well.
All right, online and offline. Okay. That concludes today's session. Thank you so much, Alex. I'll just briefly mention our next event, which will be on virtual communication. So I'm sure all of you have zoomed in and zoomed out on internal communication, and we'll have the author of this book, Nick Morgan. He'll talk about how the pandemic has moved communication online and what virtual communication will look like past the pandemic, and that will be on May 18. And don't forget to sign up either on our website. This virtual event is also free for everyone. And look forward to watching and sharing today's presentation. It will be online within 24 hours on this website. So until then, I hope you all stay safe and prosper. Thank you.